Let's talk about paraphrasing. And paraphrasing is a great skill to develop as a writer. It's the rewording of somebody else's ideas. So the rewording of their ideas. But you're not trying to pass these off as your own ideas. So you're not plagiarizing. Okay, this is not plagiarism. Instead, you are citing your source and you're really passing these ideas along honestly. But you also don't need to use quotation marks, so no quotation marks. And you can see then where it gets tricky, right? If you're not using quotation marks, but you're also not trying to plagiarize, how do you do all of this honestly? That's why we'll spend a little bit of time talking here about when you don't need to paraphrase, okay, and still you can avoid plagiarism. And then afterwards we'll talk about how to paraphrase properly, and we'll look at a couple of examples. The passage I have here for you that we're going to borrow from is from a book called Essential Dali. And this is a beautiful book with lots of illustrations. And in this rather long passage here, there's some discussion of a particular statue by the painter and sculptor Salvador Dali. And this sculpture is based on the painting The Burning Giraffe. Now, the first thing to notice here is that the first couple of sentences contain what's sometimes called common knowledge. So, common knowledge. And that's important because sometimes you may be tempted to paraphrase something and you don't even need to. In fact, this common knowledge is stuff that you could find in other sources as well. So if you were to go even to Wikipedia, you could find out that the sculpture is derived from a painting. And similarly, the height is something, that you can find in different sources. You could go to the museum yourself if you have some money, I suppose, and, go measure the statue. So common knowledge then doesn't really need a paraphrase. It doesn't need a citation. But you do want to make sure that you use your own words, that you don't just copy word for word this kind of information from a source like this. The next thing to realize is that what follows afterwards is description. And the author here is describing the statue. Now, again, if you were to look at a picture of the statue, or again, if you had lots of money and you went to the museum and you saw it for yourself, you could provide that description yourself. So there's no point using up a paraphrase. Think of a paraphrase or a quotation as real estate in your text, in your essay. Do you really want to give that up to somebody else? You can provide this information yourself. And this is also similar to what's called plot sum. So if you are doing a literary essay and you've read a text, a story, a poem, let's say, don't use a paraphrase to provide plot summary. Read the text yourself, right? Summarize it yourself. There's no need to invoke the authority of somebody else to provide this information. So I've spent quite a bit of time here on what not to paraphrase, and I think that's important because otherwise you might feel that whenever you borrow something or you find some information, you always have to cite it, and that's not necessarily the case. Where you do want to cite is anything that is interpretive. So anything that gets to be kind of interesting, interpretive, anything that's making a point or a claim about history or a sculpture in this case, or a literary text, that's the kind of stuff that we really want to borrow. So let's see then how we can do that properly. All right, in this passage, the author is talking about how Dali likes to include these drawers in his art, and they seem to symbolize something. So they symbolize the bodily orifices that Dali, with his scatological nature, is so obsessed with. Now, if you look at our first paraphrase here, what's problematic about it is that we still use some of the same exact phrasing from the original passage. So we talk about bodily orifices and the scatological nature. All right. So even though we have cited the source, it's still considered plagiarism. This is considered plagiarism because you should be using quotation marks around these exact phrases. And the rule then is that anytime you have one or two words in a row like that are quite exact, quite unique, then you need to make sure that you cite them properly. The way around this is what we've done in our proper paraphrase. So we've used our own words here. And instead of bodily orifices, for instance, we have the hidden parts of the body. Instead of this word obsession, we have a word like fascination. And that way we can paraphrase, put it into our own language, but we're still conveying the same idea. And because we have borrowed the idea, we're making sure that we cite Bradbury, and then in this case, the page as well. If you mentioned Bradbury earlier already, then you don't have to include the name here as well. And if you have a number of sentences in a row that are paraphrased, then often you can just give the range of page numbers at the end of the last sentence. So there's no need to provide the paraphrase citation after every single sentence. The exception would be if those sentences come, or those paraphrases come from vastly different portions of the book or the text, or in some cases where you may have an intervening quotation, let's say, from somebody else. Final piece of advice here, try to avoid providing too much paraphrasing because you really want to make sure that many of the ideas are your own, and so you don't want to be entirely reliant on other people's ideas.